Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to lecture number 37 for the subject of software design and architecture, ITech 4129. I am your course instructor Fahad Anwar. So students, before I start my today's lecture discussion, I would like to give you a little bit recap about our last week lecture. So students, what we discussed in our last week. So students, if you remember, we are discussing different approaches to software reuse, and in our last week we are discussing about aspect oriented software development, where I give you justifications about why we are moving towards aspect oriented programming, where I give you some examples from functional programming and object oriented programming, and I discussed very briefly, and I also give you some arguments why we are shifting from object oriented programming to aspect oriented programming, where we see we are facing actually different problems in separating the objects. So that's why we are actually moving towards the aspect oriented programming, and then we see about what actually the aspect oriented programming, and then we discuss about the further details about aspect oriented programming, where we see in object oriented programming we actually deals with object, and in aspect oriented programming actually we are our concern itself is with aspects. And then we discuss about what are actually aspects. We see some of it in detail, and then I give you some difference between aspect concern in aspect oriented programming and class terminology in object oriented programming, and I tell you some justifications how these two terms are different. And then we discuss about some core concepts of aspect oriented programming, where we see like advice, joint point, weaving, aspect, proxy, etc. These core concepts we discussed in very detail. And then we further discuss the advice concept of aspect oriented programming in more detail, where we see 5 different types of advices. And then we discuss about aspect oriented programming. We see what kind of concerns are involved in actually in aspect oriented programming, where we see about logging, security, profiling, caching, exception handling, etc. And then we see divisions of concerns in 3 different programming paradigms, where we see concerns in functional programming are functions, and then we see objects are basically concerns in object oriented programming, and we see aspects are our main concern in aspect oriented programming. And we also discuss about the division of different concerns in different programming paradigms. And then we discuss about some cross cutting concerns, what actually they are. And then we also explain this cross cutting concern with the help of some comprehensive example as well. And I also list out some cross cutting concerns from some real world examples for IT projects as well, where we see like system logging, tracing, statistics gathering, security handling, the management of garbage collection. All of these were the cross-cutting concerns which we actually identified in our last week lecture. And then we see what actually the main difference between object-oriented programming and aspect-oriented programming. And we also discuss this important point. We are not entirely shifting from object oriented programming, or aspect oriented programming is not going to replace object oriented programming. So we discuss these their difference between these two terms very comprehensively with the help of diagram as well. And then we see what kind of benefits are being offered by aspect oriented programming, and we also discuss their drawbacks of aspect oriented programming as well. So students, this is a little bit recap about our last week lecture. So students, whatever we have been discussed so far, it was a basic concept of what is actually aspect oriented programming and why we need aspect oriented programming. And now in this week we are also going to discuss aspect oriented programming. But now in this lecture, in this week lecture, our main focus will be on advanced topics about aspect oriented design and architecture. And now we will discuss this aspect oriented notion with respect to software design and architecture in more detail and in more advanced level in this lecture. And now let's formally start our today's lecture discussion. So students, here is a brief objective of our today's lecture discussion, where we see aspects role involving in software design, and then we see what kind of stakeholder concerns are there which we need to be considered in aspect oriented design and architecture, and then we see an internet banking system to better understand the cross-cutting concerns, and then we will discuss some undesirable situation like tangling and scattering in abstract definition, and in the next lecture we will see with the help of some example diagram and code as well. So here is a brief objective of our today's lecture discussion. So the first one is about role of aspects in software design. So students, basically aspect oriented programming provide, as you can say, it actually gives us the notion of you can say better mean of addressing the well-known problem of separation of concerns, and this separation of concern problem we have been discussed in very detail. Basically we see this separation of concerns actually states that like software should be organized so that each program element like does one thing and one thing only. It does not depict the multiple things. So each program element we can say should therefore be understandable without reference to other elements as well. So program abstractions like subroutines, procedures, objects support the separation of concerns. So basically there are three approaches which actually addresses the process of separation of concerns. These three approaches are named as language based approach, framework based approach, and architecture oriented approach. So if we see in language based approach, so actually students, this language based approach is, we can say, based on the definition of a set of language constructs provided by any language. So this language based approach actually involves the relevance concerns which are identified at the problem domain and we translated to a spectral construct level as well. So we can say about this language based approach, we obtain the final application by weaving the primary structure with cross-cutting aspects in this language based approach. And the next approach is about framework based approach. As its name suggests, it actually provides more flexible constructs, and in this framework based approach, students concerns are basically, you can say, materialized as aspectual classes at the framework level. So developers in short can customize these aspects using the mechanism supported by the framework or supported by the relevant framework community. So these types of framework are also known as aspect oriented frameworks. So these does not explicitly engineer concerns involved. So there are different frameworks available. You don't need to go into further details about what kind of frameworks are there. And the next one approach is about architecture oriented approach. So what is architecture oriented approach? Where our main focus will be on architecture oriented approach to address the process of or to address the problem of separation of concerns involved in aspect oriented design. So architecture oriented is our main approach to discuss in this lecture, and our main focus will be on this approach because actually it is relevance to our course outline. So how at architecture oriented approach is actually address the separation of concerns problem. So like we can say in this architecture oriented approach, like early identification of concerns using architectural models, as we discussed in very earlier lectures, different architectural organizational models as well. So we can say architectural viewpoint actually involves a higher level of abstraction than the previous approaches, because architecture level view gives the overall representation and view of the system at very initial stage. So we can say this architectural approach is more important as compared to other two approaches, because this architectural involves a viewpoint at more high level of abstraction, which gives the better understanding about what we are actually going to be built in the detailed design with respect to aspects involved in software design. And now students, there are different types of stakeholder involved. stakeholder concerns are actually involved in our aspect oriented programming. So as we discussed earlier, what actually are the concerns? So as you know, students, concerns are not program issues, like you can say, but these concerns actually reflect the system requirement, and you can say the priorities of the system stakeholder itself. So example of concerns can be performance, security, like you can say specific functionalities, etc. So we can say, students, like reflecting the suppression of concerns in a program. So there should be clear traceability, ranging from requirements to implementation in our software development life cycle phases. So core concerns can involve functional concerns, students, which actually we can say relate to the primary purpose of a system, because functional concerns are the primary concerns of a system, and there are secondary concerns as well. And what are the secondary concerns? Our non-functional requirements or quality of services requirement, we actually call the secondary concerns. So concerns are basically what? So concerns, we as see are not program issue, but actually they reflect the system requirements. So separation of concern can be dealing at two different level, ranging from requirement to implementation. One type of concern can be primary concern, which should be handled at the functionality level, and other type of concerns we call as secondary concerns, which are basically our non-functional requirements, or which we also call quality of service requirements being offered by the our architectural design and specification. So what are the different type of stakeholder concerns are actually involved? So these are the different total 5 concerns are there we need to be consider in our aspect oriented programming. So the first one is about functional concern. As its name suggests, in functional concern, basically in functional concerns we can say are related to specific functionality, like to be included in a system. For example, I say in a train control system, a specific functional concern is train braking system. How it actually applies its brake is a functional concern. So the next one is about quality of service concern. So what actually about it is, this is actually related to the non-functional behavior of a system. Like you can say these quality of service concerns actually include about the performance, reliability and availability of the system. And the next concern is about policy concerns. And what actually the policy concern is, basically this concern is, you can say, like related to overall policies that govern the use of a system. And this policy concern, students, should include security and safety concerns, and the concerns which are most related to business rules as well. So these things are basically covered in this policy concerns. And the next one is system concern. And what is actually the system concern is, basically this concern is related to attributes of the system, we can say as a whole at a system level, like we can say maintainability or its configurability. These are the system concerns. And yes, quality of service concerns and system concerns are little bit, you can say, are similar with each other, but system concerns are actually we deal with at a system level, like maintainability or configurability are, these two things are actually considered at a system level. So these are basically a system concerns. And the last type of stakeholder concern is organizational concerns. And what is actually this organizational concern? Basically, student, this concern is actually, we can say, related to the goals of organization and its priorities. Like, so we can say these type of concerns include a system should be within budget, like making use of existing software assets, which we also got a reusability, and maintaining the reputation of organization. All of these things are actually comes under the umbrella of organizational concern. So these are the different types of stakeholder concerns in any organization or for any project which should be important. So students, from here we can say that about the core concerns of a system are basically a functional concerns which actually relate to its primary purpose. So For example, I say about a hospital information system, the core functional concerns are the like creation, editing, retrieval, and management of patient records are our core concerns. Like in addition to core concerns, there are some secondary functional concerns as also there. So these may involve functionality like share information with the core concerns, or like maybe it required to the system which can be satisfied to its non-functional requirements can be secondary concerns. So all of these five types of concerns are basically our stakeholder concerns involved in aspect oriented design and architecture. So here is another example for you students about cross-cutting concerns. So students, these cross-cutting concerns we have been discussed in very detail, and now here I would like to consider an example about uh, an banking system. So this diagram is actually represents an internet banking system. So students, as you can see that we have our core concerns are those concerns which are actually related to functional services of a system, like new requirements, account requirement, customer management requirements. So all of these three are core concerns which are our functional requirements. And now you can see that these functional requirements are independent of each other, but if you see into cross-cutting concerns, these are actually our secondary concerns which are actually related to the non-functional requirements, which actually affects the overall system. As you can see that security and recovery are our cross-cutting concerns, and these two cross-cutting concerns are actually mapping to the entire functional services of the system. So in this way you can see that how cross-cutting concerns are actually affecting the performance of overall system, because actually it serves at the architecture level where the entire system is actually affected. So if you see into this diagram in more detail, students, like as this diagram is about internet banking system, so this system has requirements which are related to new customers, like such as credit checking and address verification. So it also has a requirement related to management of existing customers and the management of customer accounts as well. So all of these are core concerns which are actually associated with the primary purpose. So primary purpose is actually about functional requirements. So we can say that, however, this system also had some security requirements which actually based on the bank security policy, and there are also recovery requirements to ensure that the data is not lost in the event of a system failure. So these are the we can say, so these are the cross cutting concerns as it may influence the implementation of all of the other system requirements. So I hope so you must understand, you have been understand very clearly about the cross cutting concerns, what actually they are. So in this diagram we consider about core concerns which are the primary concerns about functional requirements, and we see about cross cutting concerns which are actually our secondary concerns. We also call them a non functional requirements, and you can see how these cross-cutting concerns or non-functional requirements actually affecting the overall performance of the system as well. So students, as we see in this diagram, security requirement and recovery requirement are our cross-cutting requirements, and these two cross-cutting requirements are actually mapping to entire functionalities of the system, and in this way it is actually we can say affecting the services of the entire system. So core concerns are actually defined at a specific functionality level, but if we talked about cross-cutting concerns, these are actually discussed at a system level because they are actually belonging to non-functional requirements. And always you should remember these cross-cutting concerns or non-functional requirements are hard to measure and hard to achieve in the entire system. So there is always a trade-off between these different cross-cutting concerns for any project. So now students, the next term is about tangling and scattering. So before I start my discussion about tangling and scattering, these are two undesirable basically situations. So I would like to give you some argument about why we need about tangling and scattering and why we need to worry about tangling and scattering. So students, actually programming language I have some kind of abstractions, like we have procedures and classes. So basically procedures and classes, we can say, are the basic mechanism which we actually use to organize and we can say structure the core concerns which are the functional requirements of a system. So but implementation of core concerns or functional requirements in traditional programming language usually includes additional code to implement these different cross-cutting concerns. I am repeating, in traditional programming languages, the implementation for these core concerns are actually required an additional code. Functional requirements can be additional code to meet these cross-cutting concerns, which can be functional, quality of service, secondary concerns can also be there, and there can be some policy concerns as well. So to overcome this situation, we actually need to two undesirable situation. These two situations are not desired by some programmer or the developers community, tangling and scattering, but actually these are very needed in these kind of situations where traditional programming languages actually require an additional code to implement core concerns or secondary concerns. So that's why there is some situation occurs where the developers does not want to go, or this is, you can say, is an undesirable situations which are named as tangling and scattering. So first I would like to give you a definition about what is actually tangling and scattering, so you can get better idea about it. So tangling normally occurs or normally comes in a situation when you can say like we have a module in a system which must include code that implements different system requirements. So it actually depicts about tangling. And if I talked about the scattering, this scattering normally occurs when you can say the implementation for a single concern, which are basically over logical set of requirement, and logical set of requirements are functional requirements. So is need to be scattered across several components in a program. As we discussed in our last week lecture, separating of object in multiple modules is a problematic in object oriented programming. So that's why we are moving toward this aspect oriented programming. So that's why this scattering occurs when we have to implement a single concern. So it need to be scattered across several components in a program. So this situation of scattering normally occurs when you can say requirements are basically related to secondary functional concerns or policy concerns, like you can say. So scattering is normally comes in these kind of situations. So students, these are the two situations of tangling and scattering. So I will explain you about in more detail with the help of some real world example and code as well about tangling and scattering in our next lecture. So students, still here our lecture number 37 is ended.